Welcome back to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. I'm Damian. I'm your host for this evening. Thank you for being here in person and also online. This evening and this year's programme is Pay What You Can. So if you are watching online and you're able to make a donation, please do so you can help keep the festival as accessible as possible. Before we begin, please make sure your phones are on silent. I would hate for somebody to get a text message from their utility company. It'd be very, very, very upsetting at this point in the proceedings. And I should say thank you to our sponsors for this evening, who are Blackford, the insurance firm, and there will be a signing afterwards. That's all the housekeeping. So to tonight's guest and tonight's book, Hamlet told the tragic story behind the world's greatest drama, and Maggie did one event for that book. She did it with me in London at my salon, and then the pandemic happened, and she did the rest of it online. So I'm hoping that after tonight, everything is fine. That book put Agnes Shakespeare centre stage. It was a story of a plague. It came out during another plague, and it won the Women's Prize. And you would think, wouldn't you, that most authors would sort of sit back, bask for a while, maybe make some sourdough. Not Maggie. So she wrote The Marriage Portrait, which is a novel inspired by a poem, inspired by a painting. And the book is as beguiling as the face that looks out of the portrait. The star of the painting and the poem is Lucrezia de Medici. Now, Maggie and I had a chat about this earlier. She's going to say Lucrezia. I'm going to try and say Lucretia or Lucrezia because I don't want to be one of those people that says they go to Copenhagen on holiday. But anyway, you'll get there. It's Lucrezia, it's Lucretia, it's Lucy, it's all of those things. But anyway, she is the daughter of the fabulously wealthy Grand Duke and Duchess of Florence. And to give you an idea of how wealthy they are, they have Michelangelo's David as a garden statue. Right? These are not the ones that you get at the Y Vale, the actual Michelangelo's David. Lucrezia is the oft overlooked fifth child of 8. She's destined to be a duchess, but she refuses the constraints that are placed on her as a result of her class, her great breeding, and also of her gender. She paints miniatures of the worlds that she imagines beyond the palace walls. And then she's married to this man called the Duchess of Ferrara. He's twice her age. She's barely a teenager. He's twice her age. He is very sexy, but he is also evil. And he can be quite nice too. So anyway, he's a sort of Janus-like figure, and we'll be talking about him. He wants one thing from this young woman. He wants a son and an heir. Will she give it to him? Can she give it to him? Let's find out. Please welcome the Renaissance woman, Maggie O'Farrell. This is amazing, and Maggie has come dressed as her book.
It was a slight accident. I was just looking at my wardrobe and I thought, oh, I'm going to wear this. And then one of my children said, you're dressed as your book cover. And I thought, I'm not going to take it off. Because how often in life do you get to dress as your book cover? I'd say not enough.
Often. Not often enough, exactly. Now, I know that you're going to give us a reading in a minute, but before then, you've got another reading to do for us. So.
Yes. And I'm not just checking my text messages, by the way. So I would like to do a really short reading as a mark of solidarity with Salman Rushdie. This is from Midnight's Children. Farouk said, "We are going to die." But Shahid was possessed by a powerful lust for survival, because having recovered from the doubts of the night, he had become convinced that this was not how he was supposed to go. Thank you.
Right then, shall we have the world premiere of your new novel?
Oh, God, talk about pressure. Yes, I'm going to go and use the lectern.
You're going to stand up at my... Do you want me to move?
No, I can move it.
All right, okay.
Sit yourself down. It's not that... It's actually quite heavy. how yeah, I'm fine,
okay,
don't worry. I'm going to start at the very beginning because Damian and Julie Andrews say it's a good place to start. So this is, I'm not going to say anything, I'm just going to read. Lucrezia is taking her seat at the long dining table, which is polished to a watery gleam and spread with dishes, inverted cups, a woven circlet of fur. Her husband is sitting down, not in his customary place at the opposite end, but next to her, close enough that she could rest her head on his shoulder, should she wish. He is unfolding his napkin and straightening a knife and moving the candle towards them, when it comes to her with a peculiar clarity, as if some coloured glass has been put in front of her eyes, or perhaps removed from them, that he intends to kill her. She is 16 years old, not quite a year into her marriage. They have travelled for most of the day, using what little daylight the season offers, leaving Ferrara at dawn and riding out to what he had told her was a hunting lodge far in the northwest of the province. But this is no hunting lodge, is what Lucrezia had wanted to say when they reached their destination, a high-walled edifice of dark stone, flanked on one side by dense forest and on the other by a twisting meander of the Po River. She would have liked to turn in her saddle and ask, "Why have you brought me here?" She said nothing, however, allowing her mare to follow him along the path, through dripping trees, over the arch-back bridge and into the courtyard of the strange, fortified, star-shaped building, which even then seemed to strike her as peculiarly empty of people. The horses have been led away. She has removed her sodden cloak and hat, and he has watched her do this, standing with his back to the blaze in the grate. And now he is gesturing to the country servants in the hall's outer shadows to step forward and place food on their plates, to slice the bread, to pour the wine. And she is suddenly recalling the words of her sister-in-law delivered in a hoarse whisper, "You will be blamed." Lucrezia's fingers grip the rim of her plate. The certainty that he means her to die is like a presence beside her, as if a dark feathered bird of prey has alighted on the arm of her chair. This is the reason for their sudden journey to such a wild and lonely place. He has brought her here to this stone fortress to murder her. Astonishment yanks her up out of her body, and she almost laughs. She is hovering by the vaulted ceiling, looking down at herself and him sitting at the table, putting broth and salted bread into their mouths. He is setting an elbow on either side of his plate, telling her about coming to this lodge, as he persists in calling it, when he was a child, how his father used to bring him hunting here. She is listening to a story about how he was made to release arrow after arrow towards a target on a tree until his fingers bled. She is nodding and making sympathetic murmurs at appropriate moments, but what she really wants to do is look him in the eye and say, "I know what you are up to." Would he be surprised? Wrong-footed? Does he think of her as his innocent, unworldly wife, barely out of the nursery? She sees it all. She sees that he has laid his scheme so carefully, so assiduously, separating her from others, ensuring that her retinue is left behind in Ferrara, that she is alone, that there are no people from the Castello here, just him and her, 2 guards outside, and a handful of country servants to wait on them. How will he do it? Part of her would like to ask him this. The knife in a dark corridor, his hands about her throat, a tumble from a horse made to look like an accident. She has no doubt that all of these would fall within his repertoire. It had better be done well, would be her advice to him, because her father is not someone who will take a lenient view of his daughter's murder. She sets down her cup. She lifts her chin. She turns her eyes on her husband, Alfonso, Duke of Ferrara, and she wonders what will happen next. Thank you very much.
Da, da, da. So, this is the first novel of yours, and that I picked up. I opened the front page, and I was like, "This reads like a crime novel," and that's not something I've seen you do as a writer before. We're straight in there with this idea that she is going to be murdered by the man that she's been married off to by her father. So, how in your mind was crime when you were writing it?
Well, it's funny. When I did the early drafts of it, I structured the novel completely differently than it ends up. and I started with her wedding day.
Right.
And I had this quite leisurely pace through the wedding day and her anxiety about it and her getting dressed. And then when I read back that first draft, I thought, oh God, this is totally wrong. I think we need to know straight away that he is going to kill her. We need to be there with her. We need to walk in step with her.
Right.
So I had this whole, I put this huge thing up on my pinboard, and I had loads of Post-it notes, and I was thinking, how do I get this to work properly? And I did read some crime books, and I also read that probably the most instructive book in a sense was Daphne du Maurier's My Cousin Rachel, which is one of her lesser-known books, I think. I mean, obviously, for a very good reason, everybody loves Rebecca, but My Cousin Rachel is fantastic.
I haven't read it.
You should.
Okay, I will.
Get on it. And so what she does is, Rachel is this fascinating character because at the beginning you think she's evil, and then for a lot of the novel you think, oh, actually she's fine.
Right.
And then at the end there's this another twist, and you feel that she's evil again. So you're never quite sure, and I thought it was in a very instructive way to look at a character and one person's perspective on a character.
When you started it off with the wedding initially, is that the same wedding scene that we get in the book later on? Because she marries the man that her older sister is meant to marry. Not only does she get her sister's cast-off husband, she gets the cast-off dress as well. The dress is quite nice, though, isn't it?
The dress is better than Alfonso, I think.
Yeah.
To be honest. Yes, she does. So then that's true. In real life, Alfonso was due to marry Lucrezia's older sister Maria, but Maria died. And so Lucrezia was ushered in as a kind of stand-in bride.
Yeah.
And she was actually 13 when they got married.
She was 13 on the day of the.
She was 13 on the day they actually got married, but he went off to France for 2 years. And I think there are letters saying that her mother said she's not allowed to go and live with him until she reaches maturity.
Yes, there's a whole sequence in the book which is about whether or not she's a woman or a girl, and it's brilliantly awkward because it relies on the privacy and secrecy that she enjoys with this fantastic character, Sophia, the nurse, who more or less raises her, about whether or not she has become a woman. And, the men are speaking in metaphors and kind of unable to watch it. It reminded me of my dad turning over Tampax adverts when I was a child. It was this kind of horror of femininity in the female body, and oh my God. But that's Lucrezia uses it to her advantage with Sophia. It buys her time, doesn't it?
Well, I did quite enjoy the idea that, because obviously Lucrezia's father, Cosimo, was an incredibly successful and powerful politician and ruler. And he was surrounded by this huge kind of court of men who would advise him politically and religiously, and I was just thinking, in terms of all this, because his daughters were destined to make these politically advantageous marriages that were basically just a kind of political union, a merger, if you like, with neighboring families or rich families, and I just love the idea that all these men who were used to discussing Republican uprisings or just had to basically talk about whether Lucrezia had started her periods.
Yeah.
And I thought, now that is quite a comic scene, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Their discomfort is so palpable and so enjoyable, it has to be said. You talked about the family there. Let's go into some detail about the Medici, because the book in lots of ways is about class, because the Medici, are incredibly rich, but they're sort of, in the context of the Roman Empire, nouveau riche in a way.
Absolutely.
And they're also a wee bit pre-mafia. There's a kind of strong crime there's a strong crime family vibe about them. I mean, he leaves the house with daggers in his boots. There are constantly attempts on his life.
Yeah.
There's just, there's all these secrets and crimes being committed all the time. So it's not a great family. It's not a safe family either.
Well, to be honest, I don't think the Medicis were unique in the way that they ruled and the way that they had to protect themselves. I mean, Lucrezia's father did, like you say, have several attempts on his life, and apparently he refused ever to leave the palazzo, which is like a fortress in one of the main squares in Florence, but he refused to leave it unless he was wearing chainmail underneath his clothes, which when you think about Florence in July, that must have been quite hot.
Quite clammy.
Really quite clammy. Yeah. And do you want to hear the worst ever assassination attempt on his life? It's really horrible.
Tell me.
He would swim every day in the Arno. This was one of his favorite forms of exercise. And he never left the house without his chainmail or without his Swiss bodyguards. And one day, as he was about to dive into the Arno, his bodyguard realized that in the mud at the bottom of the Arno, where he always dived in, someone had put loads and loads of daggers and swords.
Oh.
So if he had dived in as he normally did, he would have been completely eviscerated.
No, that is one of those delicious details that I bet you were trying to fit in the book, but just
I know.
couldn't. I know.
I did. I had to. I tried. You're quite right.
Yeah.
But eventually, I had to take it out. So it was. I mean, I think it was a dangerous thing to be a ruler in those days because it was before. It was Italy before Italy existed in a sense.
Yeah.
It was
There is no Italy at that point.
There were all these little separate city-states, and in order to bring prosperity and stability to your region, you had to be very ruthless. But no, you're quite right. The Medicis were considered, I think, by families, particularly like Alfonso. So Alfonso came from this very ancient noble family who went right back to the Roman Empire.
Yes, they were bodyguards.
Yeah. That's right. So, and they would have looked down on the Medicis as quite nouveau riche, and because the Medicis a few generations back had been merchants of all things.
Filthy.
Shocking.
Oh my God, shocking.
Absolutely shocking. So obviously Cosimo wanting to marry his daughters into his Alfonso's family was seeking a kind of a nobility.
Yeah.
And I think Alfonso was just after the cash. Really.
You think that's why he went for it? Because it was hard to work out at the beginning what it was he was getting.
Well, Lucrezia's dowry was the equivalent, was 200,000 gold scudi, which is the equivalent of £50 million.
Wow.
Yeah.
So she was very expensive.
She was a very expensive and valuable girl.
Yeah. And it's interesting because her whole person is, and all her movements are monitored and circumscribed constantly in the book. So, you'd think they might be nouveau riche, but they're certainly very rich and they have access to all the pleasures and joys. Their food is actually quite plain. They're not allowed to go out and play. They're kept almost as child prisoners within this palace. And that's her world, really, until she gets married, isn't it?
Well, it was too dangerous for the children to leave the palazzo much. So they were pretty much kept in the upper floors of the palazzo. And also, they had very strict views, particularly her mother, Eleonora, had quite strict views on how the girls should be brought up. So they really only ever saw their brothers and their tutors. Yeah. But, Cosimo, although he was basically selling off his daughters for political advantage, I mean, unusually he did, in one way, adored his wife, and I think very unusually for their class and time, he was faithful to her, and he also ceded his rule to her in his absences from Florence, which were quite frequent, which was absolutely scandalous. No one had ever ceded their rule to a wife before, and there were all these court documents with people twittering and being terrified. A woman was
and Lucrezia sees this and she makes them tell her the story over and over, which I think is very sweet, and I think lots of children do that. It's like it's their creation myth, isn't it? How did you meet mom? How did you meet dad? And she can't believe that her parents are a love match, and I think it's misleading in a way for her because she thinks, well, if I get married, I'm going to love him too.
Well, I thought it must have been hard for her because she sees her parents who are so devoted to each other and love each other, and then her marriage is, of course, very different. But unusually, I think also that Cosimo and Eleonora made sure that their daughters were educated alongside their sons. So Lucrezia and her sisters had the best possible education that money could buy. Yeah. They were fluent in numerous languages. They played music. They could paint. They learnt about ancient Greek. I mean, they knew. Their education was extraordinary. Yeah, but they couldn't fight, which is ultimately what Lucrezia finds out that she needs to do when she's put in that marriage. She understands that actually, she's been trained to sew and to be pretty and to be nice, but actually what she needs to be able to do is, stab. She needs some chainmail.
She needs some chainmail. Yeah. I wanted to talk a bit more about the place, Florence, at that time. I mean, at that time, it's one of the richest cities, not just in Italy, but the world, and it's the capital of the Renaissance. So it's seemingly quite progressive, but it's also quite superstitious. So, you've got these advances in things like materials, accounting, navigation, painting, perspective. But at the same time, people believe that, if a young woman breathes in the night air, it will go inside her and kill her and she'll die. It's a place of fantastic, fertile contradictions for a writer.
Yeah, I found the whole idea of the Renaissance filled with contradictions and dichotomies. I mean, the idea, we think of it now as the absolute apogee of beauty. We think it's Botticelli and Michelangelo and Da Vinci, and it is, of course. But at the same time, in order for patrons to be wealthy enough to support those, incredible sculptures and paintings and architecture, there needs to be, this huge amount of ruthlessness and brutality behind it. And that really fascinated me, the dichotomy of it. And I thought in particular I always felt that the Palazzo Vecchio, which is where Lucrezia was born, seemed to me like the sort of building itself was like a sort of symbol of this. It's this extraordinary, it looks like a fortress from the outside, but inside it's absolutely covered with frescoes and staterooms and extraordinary paintings. But in the basement, there's this stronghold, and it was filled with wild animals.
Yeah, the menagerie.
The menagerie, yeah. Cosimo liked to show off to his visitors his exotic animal collection and also make them fight each other.
Oh, that's just... Did he really do that?
Yeah, he did.
With the lions and the gorilla?
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
just so grim. Is the story of the tiger true?
I don't know. Well, actually, the story of the tiger, so in my book, Cosimo gets the first tiger and brings it to Tuscany, the first tiger in Tuscany. I don't know if he actually had a tiger. I slightly made that. But the incident where, not to give too much away, the tiger gets into a fight with two lions is actually based on a real event that happened in the Tower of London, because Henry VIII had a menagerie in the Tower of London.
Right.
Yeah, it was
So
just a thing
symbol.
that these rich boys had in those days. No Ferraris, just a collection of your own little zoo.
Yeah. Oh my God. We've talked a couple of times about what's true and what's not, and this is such an interesting area with historical fiction because obviously you get to decide up to a certain point what is. And with Hamnet, there was what we knew and what we thought we knew, what we knew about her that you wanted to write against the grain of her and kind of rescue Agnes. What did you know going into this about Lucrezia, and when did she enter your life? Because Hamnet was at school when you found out about the boy dying. So when did Lucrezia enter your consciousness?
Well, actually, weirdly, I'm sure you know this when you write your novels. There are some novels that creep up on you very, very slowly, and they're almost waiting behind your back to give you a fright when you turn round one day. And then there are novels, and this one actually, I was completely planning to write another book, and I'd actually started 2 books. I wasn't sure which one I was going to write. And I remember exactly when it was. It was February 2020, and it was outside my friend's house, and my daughter had just been to what would turn out to be her last play date before lockdown began. And I had been rereading Robert Browning's dramatic monologues, which I do periodically, because they are just incredible works of perfection, this kind of psychological depth and the technicalities of it and the word choice. They're just incredible. I do read them quite a lot. And I was just wondering idly whether My Last Duchess was based on real people, because some of his other dramatic monologues are. And I just looked it up on my phone, and within a few minutes, this portrait, the Bronzino portrait of Lucrezia, started downloading on my very rubbish phone. So it took ages, and I saw her headdress, and then I saw her forehead, and then her eyes. And honestly, when it was there and I could look at it, I just thought, there's my next novel.
Really?
There is, yeah. And that, as you know yourself, it's the exception to the rule.
Yeah, yes.
I wish novels always arrived like that, just almost fully formed.
And so that was all you knew about her was the portrait, and then...
Yeah, actually, there's very little known about her, to be honest. There's one portrait of her which was painted by Bronzino, and there are several iterations of it. The Uffizi owns several of them, and there's one which is painted by Bronzino's apprentice, Allori, and that's in America. And that's a full length. It's 3/4 length portrait. And we know when she was born, and we know that she died, but nobody's sure what she died of. We know that she went to Ferrara at the age of 15, and a year later she'd be dead. And there were rumours that he had poisoned her.
Were the rumours contemporary at the time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
There were rumours that he had poisoned her. And there was an autopsy that said that she died of putrid fever.
Yeah.
Which possibly means pulmonary tuberculosis. But so there's debate. No one is sure whether he murdered her or not.
Well, you have to read it and find out. But the picture, I have to say, itself is not very inspiring. When I saw it, I looked at her and I was thinking, so far, Renaissance young woman. There wasn't anything about it that's particularly striking. And then I looked at it again, and I looked at it again, and I found myself looking at it more and more. And there are things about it that don't add up. The posture of her holding this is it the other the ruby from the Borgia? Is it the Borgia's ruby? Is
I
that
don't
inside
know.
it? No.
Possibly. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she's wearing both Medici and Este jewelry.
Yeah.
And it's painted, I think, a year before she leaves for Ferrara. And she's wearing black in deference to Alfonso's father's death. So he's succeeded to be Duke, and she knows she's about to leave. I think what really struck me about it was that, Bronzino's portraits they're almost sort of photorealistic, and people's expressions often look very blank. There's a whole room in the Uffizi of her whole family, mostly painted by Bronzino. She's not there, unfortunately, but a lot of her other siblings are. But her painting, she looks really nervous, I think. She looks apprehensive. She looks really scared, as well she might.
Yes.
And I think it was that struck me. I just felt this girl is anxious and she has something she wants to tell us.
She looked like she would run out of the picture if somebody put their paintbrush down for more than a second. She doesn't want to be there. There's another picture in the book, though, which is the painting by Bastianino, which doesn't exist.
Not as far as we know. So Il Bastianino was a real painter, and he was Alfonso's most favourite court artist. He did lots of the frescoes in the rooms of the Castello in Ferrara. So I was just imagining if anyone was going to be commissioned to paint her marriage portrait, it would be him. And of course, the marriage portrait is the one that Robert Browning writes about in his poem. The Duke in his poem pulls back the curtain and reveals the painting of his wife. So as far as I know, as far as I could find out, there is no marriage portrait of Lucrezia. But I keep hoping that someone's going to write to me and say, there is one.
Yeah.
We've got it.
I wish that I'd known that, because when I read the book, I went on a 2-day Google spiral trying to find the picture. And I just think it would be really nice if you put that in an afterword for people like me to stop us. Because I was there for ages. I was like, that looks a little bit like her. Is she ginger as well? What is that? And so, but it doesn't, as far as we know, exist. But it does exist in the poem. Which was a poem that I had read at school, hadn't read it since, went back to reread it, and that is a creepy, horrible poem about a murderer confessing to another man. Basically, he's standing, if you don't know the poem, it's the Duke is standing there. There are curtains in front of this picture, which he only shows to certain people, so it's not always on display, which suggests, the picture has power, it has to be concealed, it has to be hidden, and maybe there's some shame there, but he shows the picture to a man with whom he is negotiating his next marriage to that man's daughter.
That's what's so incredible about it.
It's so grim. It's just like hiding there in plain sight. And I'd not got that level of horror from that poem when I read it first time around. It really is.
It is horrifying, I still remember reading it for the first time and reading that line where it says, I gave commands and all smiles stopped together, full stop.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that thinking, hang on a minute, what does that no? Does it mean he killed her? And that's what it does mean,
And there's a moment, you reflect that moment in the novel, it's not giving anything away to say that he says, my first Duchess. And then when she's sitting for the painting, he says, there she is, my first Duchess. And then he quickly corrects it to go, my most beautiful, lovely, Duchess that I'm not really about to kill. Awkward moment. So no, it was yes, genuinely terrifying to reread that poem. So thanks for giving me a reason to revisit it.
Sorry about that.
I genuinely had a nightmare about it. It was so horrible.
Sorry.
So let's go into time in the novel and the way that time is used in it, because we go backwards and forwards, and you've done that before in your novels, and it seems to be something that you enjoy, and it's a really good way, isn't it, to create tension. So we go between her in the present, where she's been married, and she thinks, am I mad for thinking that she's basically being gaslit at this point? And then we go back into her life. Did you write it in that order, or did you write the past and then chop the present in?
No, it was mostly written in order. I mean, like I said, I had a slight false start with my first couple of drafts when I put the marriage at the beginning, but then I got myself into a tangle, so I sort of untangled myself and realized that we need to see her right at the start, realizing that she's probably going to die. But no, I pretty much wrote it as it is. I've always, as you know, I'm not a fan of chronology. I don't really like it or recognize it as a propulsive narrative force. I don't think it really reflects the way human brains work and human memories work. And actually, the way we tell stories, even verbally, if someone says, what did you do yesterday? you don't always say, well, I got up and then I had breakfast and then I got my clothes on. I mean, honestly, we would all be falling asleep, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
You say, oh my God, you'll never guess this thing happened to me. You know, and you don't say, what time was it when?
Yeah, no, exactly what time, yes. Was it in the
was it
afternoon?
3:30 or was it 4:45? You know, I don't think we actually, storytelling for me doesn't work like that. I don't recognize it in that way. You know, I think we're much more, our experiences and our way of thinking about things and also relating things to others is much more, and also, you know, we make connections sort of thematically rather than in terms of time in a way. So that for me is the way I think about stories, and that's the way I write them.
Yeah. Okay, it's very interesting then from an editing point of view to think how you sit down to do that and then make that right afterwards. If you've got them just kind of dreaming through, I mean, there's the way that she experiences her childhood, there seem to be moments in her life which last forever. You know, days which seem to last forever. They're interminable. She feels trapped. And then there are moments of delight which are really sort of fleeting, but yet on the page, you know, might take up like sort of 3 pages. It's really interesting the way that you do that.
But I think that happens to all of us. That's how memories work, isn't it? I think we hardwire important events and they seem enormous, and yet there are days and weeks and months that can slip by. Don't you find that about the pandemic?
Yes.
I think it was 2 years. I can't really, it feels like it was about a fortnight now, even though it was time dragged, really. You know,
so you were writing this all the way, so basically you had that moment, it arrived just before the lockdown, and then you went into lockdown and you were like, I'm just going upstairs to Florence, to Renaissance Florence, to escape this hellhole that we're living in, basically.
Yeah. Well, basically, it is. The writing of the book was completely bookended by the pandemic.
Right.
So I began it that spring 2020, and I found, you know, it was an amazing resource in a way. It was an amazing place to armchair travel to.
Yeah.
You know, to Renaissance Florence and Ferrara. There are the worst places to spend your imaginative pandemic. And then, but I mean, you know, I wrote the book almost counterintuitively, really, because in normal circumstances, I would have gone quite quickly to Florence and Ferrara to do the kind of footwork and look at the buildings. But because of the pandemic, obviously, we were all landlocked, you know, or housebound. So I left. I had to write the book first, and then in September last year, 2021, when travel restrictions were finally lifted, I got myself on a plane as quickly as I could. So I was quite nervous because I thought on the plane I was thinking, what if I've got it all wrong?
Right, yeah.
I mean, I lived for a while near Florence, so I knew Florence quite well, but I had never set foot in Ferrara.
Right.
You know, I'd never been to Emilia-Romagna. And so I was anxious, you know, what if I got it all wrong? But actually what I hadn't realized was the effect of having lived with Lucrezia for 2 years. You know, she almost felt by this point like one of my children. And going to the places, you know, going to Ferrara and walking through the castello where basically she must have died, and visiting the houses where she lived, and then actually going to her tomb, I felt it was really upsetting. And so I went so all the Desdes and Lucrezia are buried in a monastery in the south of Ferrara city. And I got there, it was September 21, there was hardly any tourists around, and everywhere was shut because of COVID restrictions. And so I came to this monastery wall, and it was this huge, sheer sort of red brick wall, and they had this brilliant handle which you have to pull, which there's a bell tinkling inside the monastery. And they opened the door, a nun opened the door, and I explained in my really bad Italian that I wanted to come in and see the tomb of Lucrezia de' Medici. And there was a slight sort of kerfuffle, and eventually they said, you can't come in. And they kept saying, but you're here to see Lucrezia Borgia. So Lucrezia Borgia, the very famous, you know, also Duchess, Renaissance Duchess, she's Alfonso's grandmother.
Yes.
And I kept saying, no, Lucrezia de' Medici. And they kept saying the Borgia, and we had this kind of back and forth. And then they said to me, no one has ever come and asked to see her grave, which was so sad. You know, this 16-year-old girl who died far away from her family and everyone she knew, and no one's ever been to see her grave in, you know, 400, 500 years. It was. I did cry, obviously.
I bet you cried.
And I'd brought flowers to put on her grave. So I mean, God only knows what those nuns thought of me. It's really crazy.
They'd be like, oh, has she gone? Oh my God, the lady with the red, the crying lady with the red hair.
With kind of mad hair saying, I have to come in.
It's interesting you say to me that she was almost like one of your children by the end, because I did think that a lot when I was reading the book. You're very tender towards her and very protective towards her, particularly as she's younger and getting older. And it reminded me of the ways that you talked about your children in your memoir. There was a definite resonance there.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because someone I was interviewed by for a newspaper said, did you base Lucrezia on either of your daughters? And I
What?
said to him, did I base a teenage girl who's, is married off to a 27-year-old man and then killed on my daughters? No, I didn't, funnily enough, because I have other, hopes and dreams for my daughters. So, no, very much
Your
not.
daughters are listening at the door, like, oh my God.
What's in store?
What she can do.
Yeah, no, I have other hopes for their future.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
way.
But that tenderness was definitely.
Yes, definitely. I felt, it's funny. I mean, the only sort of hints we have about Lucrezia's life are absences, really, because her parents, Cosimo and Eleonora, because they were apart quite a lot, they wrote to each other all the time, and they were so deeply in love. Can I just say she had 12 children, so that gives you some idea of how much they loved each other.
Yes.
In one way. So they wrote to each other frequently while they were apart, and there was an awful lot of domestic details in these letters.
Where are the letters?
They're in Florence.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, they're all in Tuscan and Renaissance Spanish, so obviously I've read some of the translations.
Yeah.
But they talk, and the boys make quite a lot of appearances. Eleonora's clearly adored her sons, and they're all famous, very famous portraits of her by Bronzino with her sons in the most incredible dresses. You can see them in the Uffizi. And Cosimo's clearly loved Isabella, but Lucrezia doesn't really get much of a mention at all.
Yeah. She's sort of like forgotten middle child.
Yeah. She's the fifth child, but she doesn't really get much. And there's a sort of mention that she's not really concentrating in her lessons very much. She's daydreaming. And that's really all we have about her.
Is the stuff about her, because although the children's lives are circumscribed in the palace, she has a sort of freedom in that she has massive tantrums, and just the only thing that will calm her down or take the edge off is that they take her down into the kitchens where her old nurse, her wet nurse was, and where she just kind of plays with pots and pans. So she's a bit feral like that. Is that entirely invented?
I made that up.
Yeah, it's lovely.
I confess. Thanks.
No, I really enjoyed it because it just speaks to so much of what she does later on. It gives her a sense of outsiderness from her family. She sees these other class of people. She can understand the dialect that her nanny, it speaks in, whereas others can't. And she takes the time and trouble to understand servants, which is kind of disapproved of by the people around her. But she wants to.
Yeah. Well, I just got the feeling from her parents' letters that she was overlooked and underloved.
Yeah. Well, she's certainly not now. I mean,
I hope not.
No, she's absolutely loved. We're going to go to questions in a wee minute. We're not going to give away the ending, but I want to ask you about it. So we're going to talk around it in a really passive-aggressive way for 2 minutes. Did you set out with that intention from the beginning?
I did, actually.
That was always your idea?
That was always going to be my idea, yeah. I mean, again, it's really hard to talk about. It's a kind of ambiguous ending, isn't it? Well,
I think some people will think it's ambiguous, but I know what I want it to mean, so I'm going to say it's very clear.
Good, okay. Yeah. It's quite clear to me too, actually. Yeah. No, that was always going to be the direction I was going in, but I wasn't sure if I could pull it off. So I was a bit anxious when I was coming towards that writing part. I thought, I really want this ending for her, but I don't know if I can pull it off in terms of, fictionally or technically, in terms of
Did you backstitch the mechanism that allows it to happen, or had you left those clues for yourself as you went along?
That's a good question. I think I did. I think I always had it in mind.
Right.
Yes, the slight explanation for it.
Yeah, which works.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, it's very good. A quick question about Hamnet before we go to other questions about this book. The screenwriters sold for it, didn't they? Or is it telly or is it a film?
At the moment, I mean, these things change all the time. You never know. Yeah, at the moment, it's there's a film script, which I've read, which is very good. And they're looking for directors. And there is somebody possibly attached for Agnes, but I'm not allowed to say who, or they'll shoot me.
God, you thought the talk about the ending was passive-aggressive and teasing and annoying. Now everyone's going to be like, who is it? But anyway, I'm going to see if there's some questions from people online. Let's do that first. And then we'll go to questions in this room. Here we go. Today is the first time in all the years I've been coming to Edinburgh that I've set foot inside this building. It's pretty incredible. Have you been in it before?
Well, I came to see Cressida Cowell on Sunday.
Oh, did you? Did you have a nice time?
It was great. And my kids enjoyed it too.
Okay, so Okay, this person says, approvingly, this is Joanne, it's great that you have written about women who have been somewhat sidelined in history, also murdered by their husbands, quite sidelined, and whose stories we don't really know well. Do you have a forgotten woman in mind for a future book?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, the thing is that I think what attracts me most about the books I want to write is the other side of history, the wrong side of history, in a sense. And certainly that was the case in me wanting to write about Hamnet, because I always felt that he wasn't ever given his due. You know, not enough people knew that the similarity with his name and the name of his father's most famous play, and not enough people knew that he died, 4 years before that play was written. And so that was the engine behind that book, in a sense. And then as I was researching it, I realized that I wanted to rewrite the narrative for his mother, because I felt that she was so unfairly treated.
Yeah, just like a kind of old nag.
I know, it's just awful. Like, it makes me so cross. That was the only narrative we were ever told about her. So in a sense, and again, I suppose with Lucrezia, I felt that she, like I said, she was just overlooked and underloved, and I wanted to bring her out from behind Browning's curtain. I wanted to say, right, enough of being behind the curtain. It's time for you to tell your story. So I suppose it's no coincidence, really, that the wrong side of history is often women, because they don't always get their history's written in white, isn't it?
When I was reading the book, I was thinking about Vivian Gornick and her book, The Situation and the Story, and how, with you, the great project, it seems to me, of your fiction is that whatever the situation is, whatever the plot is, whether it's Renaissance Italy or 1920s London, or whether it's Shakespeare and his wife, the story is the story of women finding their voice, their art, making themselves present in a history in which they're otherwise absent.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. I mean, that said, I am writing about two men now.
Oh.
Which is quite exciting.
Just for a change?
Just for a change. I do know some men. I've met some. I'm married to one.
Yes.
I've given birth to another.
Yeah, you have.
So
Is that the book that you stopped doing to do this one?
No, new one.
This is another one?
Yeah.
If your editor's in the audience, So wait, so the one that you gave up, you've just left that, and then this is another one.
Yeah, it's a different one. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if, I'm sure you find this, Damian, but sometimes it's not really you who chooses the books choose you. He's nodding.
Yeah, I don't know. I just left 20,000 words of a novel about 6 months ago because I just, it was working, and it was a novel, and I just didn't care. I just didn't care about the characters. I just thought, I don't, these people are real, but I don't feel anything for them. I felt the way about them that I felt about some of my distant family members. Do you know what I mean? It's like you sort of see them to nod to at a funeral, but there's no emotional connection there. So and then started something else, and then it was just I love them. Yeah. I need to be with them all the time.
Yeah.
Them for me now. I think it's so much about the timing in your life as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so I will take some questions in the room. I'm sure that we've got lots. We've got microphones hovering around, so if you want to just put your hand up, somebody here and then somebody there. And then I'll take some more online.
Hi.
Hello.
You were talking about how Lucrezia was she had restrictions on her by her gender and class. Did you find that because you were living in lockdown and writing in lockdown, the restrictions affected how you wrote about that?
Good question.
I'm sure it's not a coincidence that during lockdown I wrote a book which is about constraint and lack of choice. Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, inevitably, I think lockdown has affected all of us in every way. It's the way we see the world and the way we live in the world and the way we perceive other people. I think I don't even think its effects have been felt. This is quite apart from its medical effects, and psychologically, I think we're all still calibrating it, aren't we, inside ourselves? So yes, I'm sure it made a big difference. I mean, I think there's a reason why I was drawn to a story about a child who was basically locked inside the gilded cage of a palazzo in Florence because it was too dangerous to go outside. I mean, you can see, can't you, where that one came from.
We don't need a therapy session to work that one out. There's a question over here as well. Oh, yes, there you are. Hiya.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, you said you went back to Florence after writing the book. Did the second visit sort of modify anything that you felt about your book? Or was it perfectly, like, exactly what you imagined it to be?
Are you perfect, or did you make mistakes?
I made a lot of mistakes all the time.
Thank you for that question, which I meant to ask.
Yes, it did. I mean, I don't know, it wasn't so much a kind of terms of what was right and wrong. I think there's, you know, I mean, I'd been to the Palazzo Vecchio years before, and I'd wandered around it as a visitor and a tourist, but nothing can really, and you know, and I'd looked at the maps during lockdown, I'd looked at the maps online, and I'd looked at photographs, and, you know, I'd scrolled through all the interior photographs of it, but nothing can replace actually standing in the room and seeing which way the light comes in through the window, or how you can see a corridor if you're standing in one part of the room, or, you know, nothing could compare. And I would never, ever want to write, or I would never publish a book about a particular building or town without having gone there. I mean, I don't think you ever could you? I mean,
but no, I couldn't. I would be so anxious that I would get something wrong, and somebody would write to me and tell me, and I'd feel awful about it. But there are novels that I've enjoyed where people have done, and I've been, like The Tenderness of Wolves. Do you remember, by Steph Penny? And in the Arctic, I think it was, and they'd never been anywhere near it, and I was totally swept up with all the descriptions.
Yeah.
I think occasionally, but I think, you know, I would want to know.
Yes. It's not a sense of getting things wrong, but also when I went to Ferrara and I was standing in the main hall, I just noticed, I was just standing there looking at it, and I noticed how the reflections of the moat were superimposed on the frescoes on the ceiling, and that's a detail that you could only get from actually standing there.
Those moments are so exciting, but also so tiring, aren't they? It's like you're absorbing all this information, and you know, and you don't know where it's going to come out in the book, but you know, but you're kind of like an antenna at that point.
I also pestered and stalked the mayor of Ferrara because I really wanted to see the Fortezza, which is a real place. It's called Rocca di Stellata, just out in a town just outside Ferrara city, and I sent him. And he was saying, please can I see inside it, please can I see inside it? And eventually one of his aides just emailed me and said, it was damaged by an earthquake in 2017 and nobody, not even the mayor, is allowed inside. So I thought, okay.
Okay, fine.
All right, fine.
If this book's published in Italy, you're going to be arrested trying to climb into that building to find out. It's clearly what's going to happen.
One day I'll get in there.
Was another hand up over, was it over here? Was it? Sorry, I can't quite see because of the lights. And I'm also aware of you all up there. Oh, doing that. I feel like I'm conducting a séance. Where's the hand? There is the hand. Person there. Please pass it along. Thank you.
So you've given agency to some women and a voice to some women. Do you ever worry what they would think, that you've got it wrong in telling their story?
Ooh.
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly, I mean, you have also written a novel about a teenager who lost their life. I mean, actually much more recently. I mean, yes, you feel a huge sense of responsibility. And I think, I'm sure you did as well. But I did. You feel a massive, and I think it's always really important to be aware that even if it's 400, 500 years ago that this person died, that they were real.
Yes.
And, you know, that's why I only use people's first names in the book. So in Hamlet, the surname Shakespeare is never mentioned, and in this, it's never mentioned. So just to give that kind of sense of elasticity, just to remind, say, these people in my novel have the same names as the real people, but, you know, you always have to be respectful of the fact that they were real and they did live and breathe. And of course, this is a fiction. This is not a biography.
No, but I think you've got to feel emotionally invested in that person, and also a sense that that person is somehow before you, and especially if they're a person who's been elided by history, or a person who has been misrepresented. I think you feel like Agnes, but where you feel, a sense of a moral responsibility to get it right because other people have got it wrong.
Yes,
it's a lot of pressure, I think, to sometimes feel.
It's a sense of wanting to right a wrong, I think.
Yeah, as much as anything else. Yes, and it'd be interesting to hear, what responses there are, from, because I also in my Googling spiral discovered that there are still Medici around.
Oh yeah, well, of course.
Yeah. They've still got their castles, and they've still got, their palaces and all the rest of it, and they kind of weirdly, creepily still look the same.
Actually, yes.
Yeah, no, you Google image search.
I'm slightly nervous now.
They're all on Instagram. The Medici are on Instagram, which is, of course, perfect for all these kind of court portraits and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
They're just doing exactly the same thing, but with different symbols. And, it's just like, look at my richness. I'm expecting Lucrezia's ruby to pop up, on Instagram and get 50 likes at any point. We've got time for another question or two. Sorry, hiya, there you go. Thank you for your question.
A lot of the themes in your books are about a life unlived, like sort of Hamlet, like sort of, in essence, was a life unlived. Although Agnes was a life described wrongly, like sort of, if you like, like sort of, and Lucrezia, like sort of obviously as well, like sort of didn't fulfill perhaps her potential, like sort of, How much does this drive you? Like sort of when you write a book?
I mean, I think there are writers who are interested in ideas, and there are writers who are interested in people, and I think I'm very much the latter. People always fascinate me. I love to know what makes people tick or what lies behind their masks. So I suppose, in a sense, my fiction is no different. I'm interested to know what people might have done, the story, the road not taken. I think that's a lot of what fiction can be. And also, like I was saying, the sort of wrong side of history, the other side of the story, what's behind the curtain. I think all writers probably want to know that, don't they?
Yeah, definitely, that kind of nosiness. Nosiness, ultimately. Yeah. We've got time for one more question from the audience, but I've got another question for you, which is that the last time we were in Edinburgh together was for I Am, do you remember?
Yes.
When it was still at Charlotte Square, and I was so tense about the whole thing that the microphone picked on my heartbeat, and it was really weird.
I remember.
Do you remember? And it was like, and there's like somebody in the audience ready to resuscitate me, and it was all quite
And somebody
dramatic.
fainted. Do you remember that?
Yes, the fainting person
fell
at the
down the
back.
stairs. Yeah.
And they did fall down the stairs.
Nobody's fainted.
Don't go near the edge of the balcony.
Yeah, please.
No. So, anyways, and we were talking there about your memoir and about the fact that you had swore to me that you were never going to write one. And I had exactly the same conversation with Kit Duval this morning, who said that she would never, ever write a memoir, and then she was asked to do it. Now that the dust has settled on that experience, and you're a couple of books after it, do you think that you would approach memoir again, or are you definitely done with it?
I mean, I shouldn't say never, because I never said I'd do the first one. But no, I can't imagine that I'd ever write another one. No, I'm quite happy to have left it. And I feel, my relationship with my memoir is very different, I think, to my relationship with my novels. I feel very differently about it.
How so?
Well, I mean, it's true, isn't it? That's, and I don't think of myself as an autobiographical fiction writer, not at all. But there are always elements in fiction of yourself that will weave into the story. But, with a fiction, you're wearing a series of masks, so people don't necessarily know. But, of course, a memoir is you, and it's out there. But it also, in a way, I wrote that book when I was, whatever I was, 43 or 44. And even that person, the person I was then is not who I am now. So in a way, it feels like a past self already.
Okay. She's still going to write another memoir, isn't she? I'm
not.
Okay, yeah. Sure, Maggie.
We'll see.
Sure. I have time for one really quick question, if you've got one. And if you have, there you are, lady there, person there, sorry.
You said that Lucrezia's dowry was enormous. What did her father get in return? And was it so large that he couldn't avenge her death?
Well, in return, I think what Cosimo got was a stake in the house of the d'Estes in Ferrara, and the idea that an heir to the Duchy of Ferrara would also be a Medici. I think there was so much focus on heirs and inheritance and who would inherit the duchy, who would take over. I think Cosimo probably liked the idea that he had a stake in that house. And he did send, so the person who performed her autopsy was from the Florentine court. So Cosimo sent someone because he wanted to know how she died. And there was no reason, I think, for him to avenge his death. But I do know that relations between Florence and Ferrara, which of course had been fairly cordial when he got married, disintegrated after that. And there's quite a lot of evidence that Alfonso had a spy in the Florentine court who was feeding a lot of information back to Alfonso about the Medici court. So I think things were very tense. I don't know why, but we can certainly interpret as to why it was very tense.
That marriage obviously did not end well. He goes on to have another 2 marriages, doesn't he? Yeah.
And neither of them produce any heirs at all.
Yes, he remains childless right until the very end. Well, listen, this is the marriage portrait that tonight has been the world premiere. So I just want to say thank you to you for being here. Thank you to you for joining us online. But thank you most of all to Maggie O'Farrell.
Thank you.